Women Crossing the Line, a space to strengthen collective power. Here, stories, resistance, and ideas converge, intertwining the struggles of Mesoamerican women with global transformations. Because crossing the line also means redefining the world map. Produced by JASS Mesoamerica. Tune in on the last Friday of every month at 11 a.m. on violetaradio.org, our Facebook page, and our YouTube channel.
Welcome to Women Crossing the Line. We are so glad you are joining us for another episode where we come together to reflect deeply on the issues shaping social movements around the world. Women Crossing the Line is a monthly program co-produced by JASS Mesoamerica and Violeta Radio. I am Daysi Flores, and today we'll explore the connections between two regions that, despite the distance between them, share many of the same struggles and aspirations. We are joined today by Vivienne Mentor-Lalu, Regional Director from JASS Southern Africa, who will share her analysis and experience organizing alongside feminist movement across the African region. But before we begin our conversation, let's take a moment to listen to this brief reflection segment.
When we think about Southern Africa, we often picture a distant region shaped by images the world has turned into clichés. Apartheid, vast wildlife safaris, or extraordinary mineral wealth. At first glance, these images seem far removed from the landscapes and realities of Mesoamerica. Yet behind them lies a reality that feels strikingly familiar. Territories rich in biodiversity and living cultures alongside communities displaced by mining and mega-development projects. Democracies weakened by the capture of political institutions by powerful economic interest. Young people caught between the unemployment and forced migration. Women and LGBTQI+ people facing multiple forms of violence. Indigenous and local communities continuing to resist the enduring legacies of colonialism. And an increasingly coordinated conservative backlash seeking to roll back hard-won rights in shrinking democratic space. While their historical trajectories differ, Southern Africa and Mesoamerica share many of the defining challenges of our time. It is from this recognition that we want to share the work JASS is doing in Southern Africa and why its relevance extends far beyond the African continent. Like JASS Mesoamerica, JASS Southern Africa offers a political framework for understanding today's overlapping crises. Gender-based violence, racism, poverty, environmental destruction, the persecution of human rights defenders, and the rise of anti-rights movements are not separate issues but interconnected expressions of the same architecture of power. Rather than limiting itself to managing the consequences of this crisis, JASS is committed to strengthening social movements so they can transform the structures that produce them. This work is unfolding at a moment of profound political transformation. Southern Africa faces persistent economic crisis, rising living costs, high youth unemployment, deepening extractivism, democratic erosion, and growing attacks on the rights of women and LGBTQI+ communities. These regional dynamics are compounded by a global context marked by shrinking funding for social movements, the consolidation of authoritarian political projects, and the spread of conservative narratives that weaponize religion, nationalism, and disinformation to divide communities and weaken collective resistance. Rather than viewing these developments as isolated trends, JASS Southern Africa understands them as interconnected expressions of structural violence. This analysis recognizes that gender-based violence, economic exclusion, racism, the criminalization of human rights defenders, persecution of LGBTQI+ people, and environmental destruction are not sector-specific problems. Instead, they are interconnected manifestations of systems of power historically shaped by colonialism, neoliberal capitalism, and patriarchy. From this perspective, the political challenge is not simply to respond to the symptoms of crisis, but to understand how these systems operate in order to develop strategies capable of transforming the power of relations that sustain them. Addressing the consequences without confronting their structural causes will never be enough. This vision comes to life through the recent Feminist Movement Builders School. More than a training program, the school is a process of feminist political education where personal experience becomes a lens for understanding political reality. Rooted in feminist popular education, its methodology takes participants on a journey that begins with personal histories and embodied experience before moving toward structural analysis and collective strategy building. By dissolving the false divide between the personal and the political, the school helps participants understand how systems of power simultaneously shape bodies, territories, emotions, and institutions, positioning collective organizing as one of the most powerful responses to structural violence. A central part of this political journey is a critical reflection on the resources that sustain movements. While much of international cooperation continues to prioritize projects, measurable outcomes, and institutional strengthening, JASS insists that the real transformative power lies within social movements themselves. Conversations with partners across Southern Africa reveal concerns that resonate deeply in Mesoamerica: dependence on external funding, the professionalization of activism, the fragmentation of struggles, and the constant risk of depoliticizing collective action. These reflections invite us to deepen our analysis by rebuilding the political autonomy of social movements, strengthening solidarity, and developing sustainable forms of organizing that do not depend exclusively on funding cycles. It is from this perspective that JASS Southern Africa brings together feminism, climate justice, and economic alternatives. Resistance is not only about opposing extractivism. It is also about creating tangible alternatives that model different ways of living. Agroecological production, community-owned renewable energy, food sovereignty, and the recovery of ancestral knowledge are not simply environmental initiatives. They are expressions of collective power. Within this vision, the idea of liberated zones represents a bold political commitment to demonstrate that it is possible to organize life beyond the logics of extractivism, market dependency, and state dependence. These reflections resonate deeply with the experience of JASS Mesoamerica. In both regions, democratic backsliding and the advance of anti-rights actors demand responses that move beyond sector-specific advocacy and instead strengthen alliances among feminist, environmental, indigenous, peasant, youth, LGBTQI+, and other social justice movements. In a global context marked by the rise of authoritarian projects, shrinking civic space, and the reorganization of conservative forces, the political heart of JASS Southern Africa carries an important lesson for Mesoamerica. If violence is structural, then our responses must also be structural. Violence cannot be challenged simply by reacting to its immediate manifestations. It must be confronted by building the collective power needed to transform the systems that produce it. Achieving this requires sustained feminist popular education, stronger community organizing, deeper cross-border solidarity, and a commitment to building alternatives that allow us not only to resist the dominant model, but to begin living here and now the world our movements are fighting to create.
And now we begin our interview with Vivienne Mentor-Lalu. She is the regional director of JASS Southern Africa and a feminist activist committed to advancing the rights of women and gender diverse people, as well as promoting social justice. Vivienne is a social worker, and throughout her career, she has worked on issues including violence against women and gender-based violence, violence against children and children's rights, sex workers' rights, government accountability and public participation, and of course, feminist governance. Her work has spanned a range of strategies and approaches, including legal and policy reform, monitoring and evaluating government performance, research and grassroots organizing, and movement building. Welcome, Vivienne.
It's wonderful to join you and your listeners today. Yes, well, I am joining you from a very beautiful a winter sunny day in Cape Town, South Africa. And it is in the afternoon here by us. I know there's a huge time difference between where I'm sitting and where you are listening to me from. So yes, Daisy, that is such a big question, right? So to think about the work of Southern Africa. But I think the best place to start is to just think about the context in which this work is taking place. And I'm sure this will resonate with many of your listeners in Mesoamerica, because across the African continent, we have seen this rise in anti-gender and anti-rights politics. And it's, I think, useful to understand this rise as part of a broader authoritarian fundamentalisms taking place. And this is a global phenomenon, right? But there's a particular way that I think it plays out in particular contexts geographically as well. So these forces, these anti-gender, anti-rights forces, are not only attacking particular rights or particular groups of people, they are actively working to narrow civic space, undermine progressive organizing, and determining whose bodies, lives, and voices are considered legitimate. So our work in Southern Africa centers around this idea that we have in JASS around the importance of bodies' rights and freedoms. And for us, they are not separate issues. They are deeply connected to questions of power, to questions of resources, voice, and safety. So I think as a starting point to frame the work in Southern Africa, I thought we'll just look a little bit at context in that way.
And I think it's very important because bodies' rights and freedoms actually talks us about structural violence, and that's something that you have been analyzing for the last the last months. And I want to, based on your analysis of structural violence, where do you see our work is heading in the coming years? What it's important?
Yes, look, structural violence is for us an important analytical lens to understand the work, because structural violence, along with other concepts, like intersectionality, for example, it allows us to see ourselves and our work and our struggles beyond the individual and beyond individual issues and incidences, right? It allows us to ask, what are the systems and structures that produce these different forms of harm that we are grappling with? And so I think that that's an important framing, and which is why we find it incredibly helpful for us then. So for example, people that are organizing around queer rights and people that are organizing around sex worker rights or women's rights or economic justice, for example, may experience different forms of violence, but there's a common system of power underneath that, right? So that framing of structural violence is really an important thing for us. And so the vision then is that strengthening the capacity of movements to understand these complex systems of power and then to organize collectively to challenge them is how we are seeing the work that is in front of us. And Daisy, you know this very well. And if your listeners had listened to previous episodes, I'm sure they would have heard other JASS people maybe speak about the importance of creating spaces where people can begin to see and recognize the connections between their separate struggles in the world. And so I think the work that we do around movement strengthening helps us to move from seeing these isolated struggles towards, asking really important questions like, what do we have in common? And what can we build together? And where is our collective power?
And in this world that is trying to isolate us a little bit more every day, I think that's very key. And it's really important that we understand how connection work, how structural violence work, but how it is connected with us. What do you think is the greatest challenge the social movements are facing today? How is it
Mm.
shaped for you?
Yeah, you know, um, social movements and activists in general, I mean, they're facing many, many challenges at the moment. And as I think about your question, Daisy, I'm thinking that it's actually very difficult to say this challenge is bigger than this challenge because they also interact with each other, right? The different challenges we face. So, you can think of repression, shrinking civic space, attacks on activists, resources, constraints on resources, disinformation, fragmentation. And each one of these challenges are difficult on its own, but when they come together, they amplify and they make organizing and activism incredibly difficult. So, activists and movements are facing enormous challenges under the current contexts.
And for you, like in Africa, for example, can you name the challenges that you face around social movement building and about this integration and the lack of space, civic spaces?
Mm. I mean, I think the thing that is really concerning me at the moment is that the forces that are opposing progressive movements are becoming, and not becoming, they are actually, at least on the continent, what we are seeing on the African continent, is that they are increasingly organized, they are really well resourced, and they are transnational. We see how they are able to operate across borders. They are sharing their narratives, they are sharing resources, and they are sharing strategies. And so the attacks and the challenges that we face don't always happen in the same form. So sometimes progressive movements and activists they face direct violence and intimidation, and sometimes they are attempts to discredit activists or organizations. And often they involve the restricting of civic space or changing the conditions under which we actually struggle to organize. And so, I think at movements then and activists then become isolated and fragmented. And I think that is really, and I'm sure this must really be sounding incredibly familiar to what the same struggles you are facing. Um, Yeah, because then often what happens, and this is very intentional, is that movements and activists are forced to organize around immediate crises. So there's one crisis after another crisis that that are that we need to respond to. And that is so understandable because the needs are so real, Daisy. But what the danger is that we are forced in some ways to become so focused on responding and to be reactive to crises that we don't have space and to step back, look at the bigger picture, build the relationships across struggles, and to imagine what comes next. And that is exactly why it happens. It's designed to put us in that place where these systems of power can benefit from keeping us reactive and separate and isolated and fragmented. So I think that for me is really one of the biggest challenges that we are facing at the moment.
And it's really familiar. You have no idea how
Yeah.
familiar everything, all the challenges that you are naming right now. It's here in the region and how we are building as well in a very isolated way. But you have also put in the center different alternatives, and you have called one of them liberated territories, and are often imagined alternatives to these systems of deportation and extraction and isolation. How does JASS Southern Africa, that under your leadership, understands and builds towards these spaces?
Yeah, I mean, Daisy, you are throwing these huge, big questions at me today. I'm like, wow, I would need like to write a whole thesis to try and unpack them. But let me try to answer them, to answer your question in a few layers. Let's peel away some of the layers. Because as I described to you, the challenges and difficulties of movements on the continent, that raises the question, which is I think what your question is actually asking of me is, how do we build and sustain collective power in a context that is constantly trying to fragment and exhaust us? So how do we do that? And I think for JASS in general and for JASS in Southern Africa, it means that we need to invest in feminist leadership, feminist political education, and movement infrastructure and solidarity. That those things are quite key in responding to the kind of crisis and context under which we're trying to organize. And this means that we need to create spaces where activists can come together, not just to respond to a crisis, but to make sense of what is happening and to strategize together. And it means connecting struggles that maybe historically have been seen as very separate struggles. And it means creating collective protection, because people cannot sustain organizing if they are constantly exposed, attacked, and isolated. So if all our energy goes into stopping the next attack, we may lose space to ask, what do we actually want to build? And I think that is what your question is asking of us, right? So
let's go back to the liberated territories. What is the proposal?
yes, that is an interesting idea, thinking about liberated territories, but it kind of ties up with some of the conversation we've already been having. So we've already said, so how do we create spaces where people can imagine the world that they want? But what I was thinking about, Daisy, it's not only about imagining the world that you want, it's also about practicing the world that we want. So how do we create space to imagine it and to practice it while we are still fighting within the world that exists? And I think I think that's really hard. It's really hard to fight off crises after crises, which is the work that has to be done. We cannot ignore the material reality of our people. And at the same time, we want to imagine and build a world that is better, that we all want, while under these conditions of repression and authoritarianism. So I do think that movements hold the space to be able to do that kind of work. And it's really difficult work. It's really difficult work to hold all those things at the same time. So, this idea of being in a state of permanent crisis, and that keeps us in this reactive space, so that we can't think beyond resisting. And so, there's this idea, what is it called? There's this idea that you need to block, which is resist, and you need to build. And so I think that is where this comes from. And liberated spaces also allow us opportunities to practice it in the now, not to wait for a future of post-liberation, post-revolution. How in our current spaces of building and strengthening movements, do we also create spaces to practice the world that we want? What JASS does and what JASS Southern Africa is committed to doing is creating those spaces. We create spaces where activists and movements and organizers can step back from that immediate crisis and come together and to do the thinking, the dreaming in those spaces. Because so we create spaces for political education, collective sense making, relationship building, and imagination. And those spaces matter, particularly under these contexts, right? These contexts that we are trying to organize in. So we are seeing those spaces that we are creating as spaces of practice, liberated spaces of practice, often still within, as we said, these systems and powers of oppression. But they do create bubbles in a way where people can experience what it means to be in a space where we listen to each other, where we share knowledge, where we build trust, where we develop collective analysis, where we make decisions together. And in that sense, it is helping us to practice the relationships and the forms of power we want to see going forward. And I think that's why the feminist movement schools and our feminist popular education practices are so crucial, because JASS will not be creating liberated spaces. Movements will be creating them. But first, we need to find ways of how we're going to build the muscle for those alternative worlds that we want to see. So liberated spaces are places where we can block and build, and where we can dream and where we can practice in the current, in the here and the now.
And I want to ask you if you have any a message for all of us, but also for solidarity within regions.
So let me start by hoping that you will then take this message and send it to Ofreni. So I want to say, I'm Vivienne. I work for JASS. I'm a feminist activist based in Cape Town, South Africa. And hearing of your struggle saddens me, but it also makes me angry, and it gives me energy and hope to continue fighting. And I want to send a message of solidarity, love, and hope to you in your ongoing brutal battle for your rights and for justice and for liberation. In South Africa, we say amandla, and that means power. So we stand by you as you fight for your righteous power.
Thank you very much, Vivienne. Thank you. Thank you for your solidarity with Ofrane, and thank you for being here in Women Crossing the Line.
It was my privilege. Thank you.
We've reached the end of today's episode. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us next month for another edition of Women Crossing the Line here in Violeta Radio. I am Daysi Flores, and today's program was produced with the support of Mario Chavez. Until next time, stay tuned.
This was Women Crossing the Line, a radio production by JASS Mesoamerica. Because crossing the line also means redefining the world map. Tune in on the last Friday of the following month at 11 a.m. on violetaradio.org. Listen to our podcast on SoundCloud and Spotify on Violeta Radio and Women Crossing the Line.